Chapter 6, White Death. Grandfather did not have much, if any, contact with the white culture in his youth. Slowly, through the years of his travels, he began to encounter more and more of the white man. He did not despise the white race, only their way of thinking. It was contrary to everything he believed in, and most of all, contradictory to the laws of creation. He could find no real truth in the lifestyle of these people. All he found was a culture that chased the false gods of the flesh and destroyed everything in their path. He saw a culture that killed its grandchildren to feed its children, a culture that made decisions for the satisfaction and convenience of the flesh today, threw away tomorrow, decisions that would one day destroy the earth. Again, it was not the white race that Grandfather so loathed, but their way of thinking and living, which is the thinking of the global society today. I remember when I was still quite young, hearing Grandfather talk of the white race with a tone of hatred in his voice. It bothered me deeply for the first few months that I was with him. He held the white race in contempt, and I was white, so I began to think that he hated me too. I often wondered what he really felt about me, but was afraid to ask. I guess that I really didn't want to know. Any time he said something about the white race, I held myself responsible for the entire race itself, as if I were one of the causes of his anger. I felt very guilty at times, especially when we encountered destruction, dumping, or pollution. This tended to get very confusing for me, for he never said anything about my being part of it at all. He treated me much like a loving grandfather would treat his grandson, yet I still felt responsible for the sins of the whole white race. As the first few months went by and we encountered more and more destruction, this question of how Grandfather felt about me began to weigh very heavy on my thoughts. The guilt that I felt became very profound at times. Every time I heard Grandfather speak of the destruction and ignorance of the white race, I would drift into a depression that would sometimes last for several days. I just could not understand the contradiction of how Grandfather could despise a culture of people and not hate me at the same time. After all, I was part of it all. I lived in a house, rode in cars, and went to school like everyone else. Was not I also as responsible as everyone else? I just could not understand how Grandfather could make any separation between everyone else and me. Finally, unable to bear the confusion and guilt any more, I asked Grandfather how he felt about me. We had been on a short hike away from the medicine cabin when we came upon a huge illegal dumping ground. We had been to that area not 2 months before, and the area was as pristine and untouched as any natural area of the Pine Barrens. In fact, we had camped near a small stream, had freely drank from the waters without fear. Now it lay in ruin. Stretching before us lay all manner of debris, from household goods to old paint cans, twisted metal, rotting food, cans, bottles, drums of motor oil. The stream now was choked with litter, vile and contaminated with a slick of iridescent oil. Many trees had been randomly cut and left where they lay to make room for the trucks to dump. Everywhere was the stench of rotted garbage, the caustic smell of undefined chemicals. Grandfather stood at the edge of all of this destruction and cried. I was horrified beyond words. I could see the look of pain in Grandfather's face. It was a look generated by severe loss mingled with hatred. I knew that he could not comprehend this kind of destruction, for it was far beyond his way of thinking. It was as if someone had wantonly killed his mother. Grandfather damned the white race with a seething anger, an anger that Grandfather rarely showed, turned to me and said in a trembling voice, "You see, this is caused by stupidity. These people think that they can live above and beyond the laws of creation. They destroy and feel no remorse. They destroy the land because of their lust and greed. They care nothing of the land or tomorrow." I was overwhelmed with guilt and simply told Grandfather, without thinking, that I was sorry. Grandfather looked at me and asked, "What do you have to be sorry for? You are not one of these people." I then told Grandfather of my plight. I said that I live much the same way as these people and that I am part of the white man's culture. I told him that I am white, not Native American, and thus part of this destruction. I told him that I could not understand how he'd hate the white man's destruction and not hate me also. I also said that I did not understand what he meant when he said that I was not one of these people. A look of concern came over his face, for he must now have realized that I did not understand and could not make the conscious separation between me and the white man. He smiled at me lovingly and said, "I do not hate the white man, grandson, just his way of thinking and living. You are not a white man, but a child of the earth. Skin color and blood do not make you a child of the earth. It is your heart and your beliefs that make you one with all things. I do not condemn or curse the white race, only their ignorance and destruction. They know no better. They are not my enemies, but their ways are. I have never considered you in this way, for your thinking, for your heart has always been as one with the earth. I hate no one, not even my enemies. I hate the ignorance of these people, and that is what I curse. It is their ignorance that I will fight, not the people. Not every white man destroys the earth, as not every Native American protects the earth. No race is responsible, but we are all responsible for ignorance. Grandfather went on to explain to me that he did not always think that way. There was a time in his life when he blamed all the white race for destroying the earth and hated them all. He told me that he had carried this hatred for many years of his wanderings. He saw no good in the white culture. The same culture that was destroying the earth had also destroyed many tribes and people of the earth. He had seen the imprisonment of all tribes, the starvation, and the living conditions that were worse than any of the white man's animals could even bear. Though he hated the white man, he saw no use in fighting against them, for their numbers were too strong. Many of his people had died in the past, and a true warrior was always the last to pick up the lance. Instead of confrontation, Grandfather just chose to avoid the white man at all cost. He did not even think that they could be taught the old ways, far less listen to what he had to say. He told me that all of that hatred changed and refocused at one point in his life where he no longer hated the white race, but only their way of thinking. It was in the first 10 years of his wandering that this metamorphosis took place, and he finally found in his heart a love for the white man. His early years of wandering had taken him to many different parts of the country and deep into vast new wilderness areas. Many times, in order to get to certain areas, Grandfather had to pass dangerously close to white civilization. He feared for his life, and he knew if he were caught, he would eventually be imprisoned on a reservation. That is why he always sought to travel in the deepest and most inaccessible reaches of the wilderness. It would be highly unlikely that any white man would be there. So too was his stealth as a hunter and scout far superior to that of the white man. He could exist where others would die, and he could become invisible to anyone who tried to find him. He needed nothing of the outside world. Thus it became easy for him to avoid the white culture. Even to those trappers who sometimes wandered the wilderness alone, he found no contest. They were just barely better off than their white brothers of the cities and towns. They could never be part of the land, for their life and thinking kept them removed from that oneness. They were aliens, did not belong to the earth, to Grandfather. Their survival skills were inept, and their existence in wilderness was a joke. Even those who removed themselves from the white culture to make a living from the wilderness still needed the tools of white society to survive. In his travels, though rarely, Grandfather would secretly observe the activities of small towns and villages. He would prowl the limits, just outside the sight of man and animals, observing the commotion that went on. He would listen to conversations, watch people's walks, observed how aware they were of their surroundings, and look into their faces for clues to their happiness. Though he detested the stench and commotion of these places, he knew that he had to learn what they taught firsthand. His skills as a scout enabled him to travel easily within the confines of any town and avoid detection. He could easily become invisible to animals, so escaping man's detection was effortless. He wanted to know what drove the white race to this insanity, to this destruction. He wanted to comprehend the consciousness of that alien society in its fullest. That way, knowing why, he might be able to come up with a way to re-educate them. The more a Grandfather observed the workings of the white race, the more he detested them. He could see no way of reaching them with the truth. To him, they were a lost cause. They were nothing more than a group of encapsulated, unhappy people, unaware of themselves and the world around them, or even each other. They did not even know that they were unhappy. It seemed to Grandfather that a man's happiness, his success in this society, was based on external possessions and little else. These people seemed to fret, to strive, and to slave with little other purpose in their lives than to make things more convenient. They looked upon wilderness as a hostile environment, something that should be avoided at all costs. White man tried to insulate himself from the life-giving forces of the earth, to remove himself and to control his environment. In this society, it is a constant battle between man and nature. White man wanted to rise above all laws of creation and bring it under complete control. Grandfather never went near the larger towns. Instead, he kept to the smaller hamlets. Even from a distance, big towns were more than Grandfather could handle. He had no idea that there were even bigger towns called cities. So in his early days of exploring the white man's civilization, he stayed to the small hamlets and homesteads. There was always enough going on in them to satisfy his curiosity. Even in these small places, he was appalled at the waste, at the way man farmed and kept his animals, and at the conditions that the white man chose to live under. He could not imagine that there could be anything worse. That was until he took his first journey toward the east and encountered a city the white man called Chicago. Grandfather had been wandering over the prairie country through what he learned the white man had called Iowa. He had been wandering toward the east for days, avoiding the hamlets and homesteads that he encountered along the way. He could not understand the numerous fence rows that he had encountered along the way, and with each passing days, the fence rows and cultivated fields became more numerous. He was appalled at the fact that the buffalo had once freely roamed these prairies and now were all but gone. Gone, too, were the Native Americans who once roamed these prairies. Now the very prairies themselves were disappearing to the fields and fence rows of man. Cattle now roamed in the place of buffalo and saddened Grandfather. He remembered stories about buffalo on the plains and how the herds were so large they stretched from horizon to horizon. Now all was lost to the greed of the white man. As grandfather continued his eastward trek, called more by inner vision than by mindful purpose, he began to see more and more signs of modern civilization. It became more and more difficult to avoid the farms and towns of man. Eventually, grandfather was compelled to travel at night to remain undetected. After a while, that even became a difficult task. He had to take great care as to where he set his camp for fear of being located when he was asleep during the day. Still, he was driven onward, but now by the force he could only define as spirit. He knew that he had to continue his journey, but he did not understand why. He was now far removed from his natural element, in the fields of society, almost like being behind enemy lines in his mind. Here he felt like an alien. Midway through what started out as his typical night travel, grandfather began to hear strange noises in the distance, sounds that he never heard before. Looking toward the east, he saw an eerie glow in the sky, the color of which he had never witnessed before. Often, wind would change direction and he would catch a terrible stench that at times would make him sick to his stomach. As he moved on, all of the strangeness intensified until a point where he was absolutely terrified. He did not know its source, whether man or spirit, and decided to camp where he was and await full light before he went on. He hardly slept the rest of the night, being awakened frequently by the stench, the strange sounds, and the lights in the sky. It was just before dawn when grandfather finally fell into a deep sleep. He was awakened by strange noises and the distant voices of people. Cautiously, he looked up from where he had fallen asleep. To his shock, he had fallen asleep on a small tree-lined hill overlooking a road. On the road, a horse and wagon were going by, loaded with several pigs. The driver and his passenger were talking loudly so as to be heard over the creak and the rattle of the wagon on the bumpy road. Grandfather laid close to the ground, fearing that he might have been seen. He waited for a long time before he put up his head again, and only after he was sure the wagon was well away from the area. He looked again, up and down the road, but there was no other evidence of people coming. However, he could see by the wear marks in the dirt that the road was heavily used, and he was sure that there would be more people coming along at any time. He slowly arose from his open bed, and to his horror, the hill was right between two roadways. All around him, and stretching for miles, was nothing more than rolling hills and grasses. There were only a few islands of deep vegetation. During the wanderings of the previous night, it had not been obvious to him that he was traveling right out in the open. The small rolling hills had given him a deceptive sense of security in darkness, but now he realized how vulnerable he was. He could easily be seen from any direction and began to feel like a cornered animal. Scanning the area around the hill, he saw people working in various fields, preventing him from backtracking. Before him lay the road, and beyond was a small homestead. He could clearly see that in the distance there was a small town. There was no way he could escape, at least not until darkness. He cautiously laid back down and carefully buried himself in the fallen leaves. Unless someone walked right up on him, he would be safe. For hours he lay motionless as he heard numerous wagons pass and more people talking. Near the middle of the day, all travel seemed to stop, and he could hear no sound coming from any direction. He cautiously lifted his head from the ground to get a look at the area again. No one was around, nothing was moving. People had seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. As he scanned the immediate area, he lifted his eyes to the distant eastern horizon. From his perch on the small hill, he could barely make out the outline of a distant mountain range, but it was nothing like any range he had ever seen. It seemed to rise out of the plains like a wall, terminating the wilderness in all manner of geometric forms that defied anything the Creator would make. He scrutinized the distant mountains, trying to understand them, when to his amazement he spied several columns of smoke arising from the peaks. At first he thought that the smoke was from campfires, but it was far too much smoke to be from one camp. He then thought it could be from the brush or forest fire. But the smoke columns did not travel over the ground. He was mesmerized by the distant range, trying desperately in his mind to figure out what it was all about. It was then that he saw the numerous roads that lay before the cliffs, and the movement of wagons and people along those roads. To his horror, he realized that he was looking at one of white man's great cities. He had never seen one before, and had only heard about them from various people he encountered in his travels. This was more than he could bear, and all he could do was stare at the city, terrified. He was paralyzed with fear. He could not imagine something so immense that it would appear as a mountain range from the distance. He gazed at the thick blanket of smoke that hung about the city, and he could not understand how these people could live in such conditions. He waited at the crest of the hill for hours, trying to comprehend the vastness of what he observed. He wondered if it could be, in fact, some sort of hallucination, for there was nothing he had encountered in the past that would even compare to this. His fear was laced, however, with a certain fascination, and he wondered if the spirit would have led him to this point to observe this city. After all, he had no idea why he had wandered so far to the east, other than it had felt like he had been compelled to do so. As the sun began to set and the lights of the city began to make the clouds of smoke above glow with an eerie light, Grandfather began to scan the landscape leading to the city. In the last remaining light, he began to plan how he would reach the city unobserved. As usual, he waited until full dark before he moved. He had the entire journey mapped out in his mind. He knew how long it would take him to get there and back, where there were safe hiding places along the way, and where all the probable escape routes were. He knew if he were caught in the area, he would probably be taken to a reservation or possibly even killed. He had to be extremely careful. His fear was now set aside, and curiosity began to guide him, though deep inside his apprehension was intense. The journey began with relative ease. He stayed to the landscapes that held the most brush and cover. When crossing a road, he was careful not to leave any tracks, which was not very difficult to do. From his experience, he doubted if anyone here could track him, or for that matter, see tracks at all. He knew that some of the mountain men that he had encountered could track, but not very well, to say the least. His trip took far longer than he expected, and he covered only about half the distance that he should have. Most of the reason for the slow travel was that he had taken great care in his movements, taking no chances of being seen. The trip would have gone much faster if he did not have to worry about being caught. He began to realize that he would just barely make it to the city before first light. There would be no way he could make it back to the hill by the next morning. As he approached the city limits, the first thing on his mind was to find a place to spend the day without being seen. It was so difficult to get within the limits of the city. Huge garbage dumps and choking air made any real progress painful. Even during this early hour, there were many people about, but Grandfather suspected that these must be ones without homes. Such was their actions. To him, they appeared to be no better off than the rats that fed in the dumps. At least the rats seemed to have a place to live. These poor souls just slept in the streets, under buildings or in doorways of buildings. They appeared battered and lonely, victims of society that did not work for them. He was appalled at the general condition of the city, and it sickened him to be so close. It was horrifying for him to realize that he would have to spend an entire day enveloped in this insanity and stench. He searched around the outskirts of the city, looking for a place to spend the day without being seen. Now he had to take great care in his movements, for now he saw many more people wandering or sleeping on the streets. He clung to the shadows and piles of nameless debris that covered the street. Several times he had to slip by a sleeping tramp, but he began to realize after a while that these people seemed to have very little awareness. His travel became easier as he realized that he had very little chance of being seen. Finally, as the first glimmers of daylight began to appear, he located a place to spend the day. It was a raised wooden platform with wooden planks for sides, appearing much like a pen. He knew that if he could get inside the platform, he would have a clear view of the city street and yet remain out of sight. He crept up to the platform, deftly sticking close to the shadows. A man sat on a chair just outside the door that led to the platform. Grandfather could see that the man was wearing a gun and an unmistakable uniform, probably a soldier or sheriff of sorts. It took him almost a full daylight before he reached the outskirts of the platform and crawled under. Luckily, there was a side plank that had come away from the post, and it gave him just enough room to get inside. Once inside the sanctuary of the platform, he breathed a sigh of relief, finally feeling somewhat secure after hours of torment. He did not move at first, but relaxed to compose himself and listen for any sounds that could be a threat. After all, the guard now sat just above him on the platform. Grandfather worried that the stench of the city would make him cough and alert the guard. As the first shafts of daylight filtered through the cracks of the boards, Grandfather got his full look at the inside of the platform. At one end there was a pile of broken boards, bits of twisted metal and broken glass. On a distant wall were the remnants of an old trap door now wired shut that would have at one time given an easy access to the underside of the platform. Strewn randomly against all the walls of the platform were piles of garbage, mostly paper and dead plants that had attempted to grow in the sterility of the soil. To Grandfather's horror, imprinted in the dirt were evidence of human tracks, hand and knee prints, and several definite outlines left by a sleeping person. He suddenly realized that the area was also probably used by one of the tramps he had encountered when he reached the city limits. However, now it seemed to be abandoned because the tracks were many days old. Grandfather began to move deeper into the platform when he heard the guard move above. He froze his action and listened to him walk back and forth several times, stopping here and there to look around. Suddenly, Grandfather heard a cough coming from the other side of an old lumber pile, and the guard jumped from the platform and moved to the old door. Grandfather lay close to the ground and slid close to the darkest wall and covered himself in bits of garbage. The guard began to call out through the slats in an angry voice. Grandfather could not understand the language, but he knew that the man was angry. Instantly, there was an abrupt stirring sound coming from the pile of old wood, and in a flash, a young man jumped the pile, crawled quickly across the floor, and began to move toward the other side of the platform. The guard hurried around the outside to the side the young man was headed for. Without thinking, Grandfather grabbed the young man by his arm and pulled his hand to his mouth, indicating silence. The young man looked at Grandfather in terrified amazement, but obeyed without question, probably more out of fear of Grandfather than out of will. Grandfather then picked up a small block of wood and tossed it against the distant side of the platform. The guard responded by running to the other side with a demanding scream. The guard listened for a moment, and then, thinking that whoever had been under the platform had escaped, ran down the street, thinking that he was chasing the trespasser. Grandfather smiled at the young man, and the man gave Grandfather a half-hearted, reserved smile, still appearing very frightened. Grandfather and the young tramp eyed each other for a long moment. The young man looked like he was torn between running away and staying. His curiosity getting the better of him, the young man asked Grandfather his name, but Grandfather did not understand. Seeing immediately that Grandfather did not understand his language, the young man pointed to himself and said, "Paul," then pointed back to Grandfather. Grandfather, now realizing what the young man was trying to convey, pointed at himself and said his name. The young man did well with the difficult pronunciation of Grandfather's name, and they both laughed silently. They spent the better part of the morning trying to communicate with each other. By early afternoon, language no longer seemed a barrier, and they became immediate friends. It did not take long before Paul realized that Grandfather wanted to learn of life in the city. Paul realized that it was more to satisfy Grandfather's curiosity than wanting to live in the city. For the next several months, Paul began to show Grandfather his world. Most of their journeys were taken at night, so they could easily travel without being seen. Grandfather saw the factories, the slaughterhouses, houses, slums, and roadways. He was appalled at the thought that people were starving in the streets while others seemed to have everything they wanted. He found there was no real brotherhood between these people of the city. Everyone seemed to be self-absorbed in their senseless rushing, fretting, striving, and slaving for unseen riches. They seemed to live to work. He could not understand what drove these people, how they could live so far removed from the earth and its life-giving forces. They seemed to be imprisoned not only by the sterile walls of the city, but by their own flesh. It seemed to Grandfather that these people believed only in flesh, and the flesh became their only God. The only ones who seemed close to being real and alive to Grandfather were those people like Paul who lived in the streets, a free life. Yet there was no freedom for them, for they were slaves to the trash heaps and imprisoned by the city. He knew that they would surely perish in the wilderness, yet there was a camaraderie that began to build between Grandfather and these tramps. The friendship between he and Paul began to grow strong as the weeks passed, to a point where they became inseparable. As Paul began to show Grandfather the ways of the city, Grandfather began to show Paul his ways. He began to integrate his wilderness skills to the wilderness of the city. He taught Paul and many others how to build fine, warm shelters, hidden from the eyes of others. He taught them how to hunt and trap outside the city limits and showed them many edible and medicinal wild plants. He taught them to use stalking to evade their enemy and move freely about the city, and he taught them to read tracks of both man and animals. Most of all, Grandfather began to teach Paul and his friends the philosophies of wilderness. He told them of ultimate freedom from all that bound people to the city, and he explained to them that they could go back and live in perfect balance and harmony with the earth. There began to form on the outskirts of the city a small village of people comprised of Paul, Grandfather, an assortment of tramps and derelicts. Grandfather became the unofficial elder, for it was he who showed them how to free themselves of the garbage piles and cold streets. Little by little, Grandfather began to wean these people from the city altogether. It was rare that they would ever need anything from the streets, yet the people had no idea that they were depending less and less on the city. They had no idea of Grandfather's master plan, but they trusted him like a kind of old father figure. Their little village was so well hidden and protected that it was never found. Even after the addition of a large hidden lodge that would be used for meetings and teachings, the camp remained invisible. Slowly, the little village became a tribal society. People began to work together for the good of the tribe, and as always, the preservation of the earth, for their home, was the most important. Late in the summer, the council, as the tribe now called itself, decided to move the camp further up north and deeper into the woods. They knew that the winters would be cold, and they needed the protection of the woods from the storms and from the eyes of city dwellers. It was a slow process because the camp had to be moved during the night and in stages. The northern camp had to be mostly built and livable before the entire tribe could move. Colder weather was coming in fast, and they had to be assured of good warm shelters at both locations. Finally, by mid-fall, everyone was living in the northern camp. The old camp was scattered and abandoned so as to disappear back into the earth. There remained no evidence of the camp's existence. The council found that it was far easier to live in the northern camp than in the old location. They could freely move about in the day, food was more plentiful, and people grew strong and healthy. Throughout the cold winter, everyone was comfortable and well-fed, thanks to grandfather's teaching and ability to store food away. Here people began to work together even more. They no longer relied on finding discarded clothing in the city, but began to make their own. In fact, it was rare now that they would ever use things that were manufactured. Instead, they preferred to make everything themselves. So too did their understanding of the philosophy of living with the earth grow strong. It was not long before they truly became children of the earth and began to despise the ways of their white brethren. Grandfather continued to teach these people throughout the entire winter and into the next spring. They learned quickly not only the skills of survival, tracking, and awareness, but also the spiritual teachings. They seemed to hunger for the wisdom of the Spirit more than anything else, and Grandfather willingly filled that void. Grandfather had never met a group of more enthusiastic people. Certainly, he had tried to teach his skills many times before, but most times he had been met with mild disinterest. These people had tasted the insanity and prisons of the city and now hated that way of thinking and living. They wanted the riches of freedom and purity. Many would have rather died than go back to the way their lives used to be. Now the only time any would return to the city was when they were looking for others to come and live in the council tribe. By midsummer, the northern camp had grown to almost 3 times the size of when it started. Now many of the original people were teaching the new arrivals, passing down the knowledge of survival and spirit that Grandfather had taught. Grandfather had not only become a legend here in the village, but also in the streets of the city where hobo communities existed. It became obvious to Grandfather that because the tribe's existence was becoming known and because the size of the village had expanded, they would have to move further north and deeper into the wilderness. He was also feeling the calling of the spirits again and knew that it would soon be time for him to move on. With that thought, there grew a great pain in Grandfather's heart for these people who lived like the people of his own tribe. Grandfather went with Paul far into the North Country to scout out potential camp locations. Finally, after several days of travel, they came upon an ideal location. Grandfather would now be sure that the people would do well in this place and forever stay out of the range of the white man. These people were now more Indian than white, and Grandfather knew that they could very well face the dangers that any child of the earth faces. It was on his way back to the main camp that Grandfather told Paul of his plan to leave. Both cried and held each other for a long time. They had not only become friends, but brothers, in the truest sense of the word. They knew that the separation would be very painful. Grandfather told Paul that he did not think that he could ever love a white man, and Paul said that he never thought he could love an Indian. They both laughed well into the night and cried tears of joy and pain. Grandfather remained at the main camp for several days as people packed up and prepared to move north. Finally, on the last night together, the people held a feast in Grandfather's honor and to honor the first child born to the tribe. Grandfather felt so at peace and so satisfied. Not only was everything eaten taken from the earth, but no tools of the white man were seen. Only some of the new arrivals had on the remnants of white man's clothing, but Grandfather knew that it would not be long before even these things were abandoned. They feasted well into the night, finishing with a tremendous pipe ceremony where all participated. There was dancing and singing, and the night air reverberated with laughter and shouts of joy. Grandfather was gone before first light, saying goodbye to no one, as was his way. He did not believe in separation, for in the world of the spirit that moves through all things there can be no separation. Thus, the term goodbye is a lie. As Grandfather sat on the high hill watching the camp moving north, he was struck with a great sense of loneliness and loss. He felt the same love for those people as he did for his own. They were his tribe now, and he would miss them. He finally understood that it was not the white man that he hated, but the white man's ways, his thinking, and the way he destroyed the earth. He loved these people of the new tribe and knew without a doubt that they were children of the earth. He finally understood it was not the color of the skin that made a person one with the earth, but what was in their heart. At once, Grandfather realized that all people were truly his brothers and sisters, and he had to love them. After hearing Grandfather's story of the Council tribe, I too could finally find peace. I now understood that when Grandfather cursed the white man, it was not the man that Grandfather was cursing, but his choices, his ignorance. I also learned that Grandfather loved everyone, even his enemies. He could have easily not bothered teaching those vagabonds and derelicts, but out of love for them and for the earth, he chose to stay with them and teach as much as he could. I only hoped then that I could find the love of people that Grandfather possessed. What became very apparent to me was the fact that once the skills of wilderness were learned, man could regain his self-respect and take charge of his destiny. It was not the color, race, religion, or economic status of a man that took him away from the earth, but the way he thought. There are those in every society that turn their backs on the earth, not because of choice so much, but because of ignorance and greed. Good or bad, I have to love them all, even those who would otherwise destroy the earth. Wars and hatred will never change anyone or anything, but adds power into itself. Only through love for all people can we ever hope to make a difference. But first, there must be love.